So we've had a lot of feedback from the sermon on Sabbath in regard to the atonement and understanding the atonement. And I think I just want to reread a statement from Faith I Live By, page 104. These passages, thankfully they start to stay in my head. So no, I can't forget that one. FLB 104. And this is a statement, or this is what we covered on Sabbath. Without Christ, the law of itself was only condemnation and death to the transgressor. Without Christ. This is interesting. And there's a whole, if we unpack that, there's a whole lot of reasons. There's a whole lot of reasons for that. And think about what we've studied in terms of the divine pattern. Christ's submissive spirit is what keeps us connected to the Father, so that we approach the Father as in a submissive spirit, recognizing him as the source of life. And you just think about the basic mirror principles. If you would approach God as an equal, when he is the source of life and you're not, and you mirror back your own thinking about him and you, it's going to kill you. The mirror will kill you. This is the thing, because we don't self-exist, he self-exists. If we approach a being incorrectly and inappropriately like that, the mirror will kill you. You will cease to exist, because the person you imagine yourself to be doesn't exist. Because we're not self-existent. Just from that point of view, you're going to destroy yourself while you're wrong thinking. And it's not that God's doing the destroying. It's this wrong understanding. So, without Christ, the law is only condemnation and death. And because Christ is the manifestation of the law of God. And so we need to unpack this more and more. But it goes on and it says, it has no saving quality, no power to shield the transgressor from its penalty. It's just interesting language, isn't it? The transgression of God's law made the death of Christ essential to save man and yet maintain the dignity and honour of the law. And again, you can read that two ways, can't you? The law, you could say, if the law itself had that death penalty in it, if it was inherent in the law, it wouldn't need to be the transgression of the law that made it essential. The law itself makes it essential. You understand what I'm saying? The law makes it essential. The transgression of the law is simply the outflow of what the law already possesses within its own jurisdiction. Does that make sense? But it was the transgression of the law that made the death of Christ essential. And you remember all of our discussion in regards to the sermon on the penalty of sin, that Lucifer introduced the lie that God does not forgive. He would not forgive. This is a transgression of the law. To say that God does not forgive is to transgress the law, because the law is a transcript of God's character. And to say that he doesn't forgive is to violate the law. Does that make sense? Yes. This is critical to understand what sin is. Sin is an attack on God's character. That's what sin is.
And it began with Lucifer.
And it began with Lucifer, knowing God's character, knowing his mercy, his love and his grace, he attributed to God that which was not him. That's sin. So we think of sin as a set of rules and you choose to go contrary to those rules. No, you're going contrary to the character. You're attributing to God that which is not him. This is sin.
And it's choosing to separate yourself from God, which is death.
Yeah. And that death comes about because you choose to believe the lie, you shall not surely die, that you have life in yourself. That is death. Because we have no life in ourselves. We only have it from God. And to say, I can be like God, is death. Again, it is an identity. This is the identity war. We go back to the identity war again. Choosing to believe something about ourselves that is not true leads to death. And so Satan, by instituting this lie that God does not forgive, that is the sin that gave Satan the power of death. Once you believe that God does not forgive, then you're under the power of death. And we have inherited this lie. We have inherited the lie that God does not forgive. And how do we know this to be true? How many of us have had difficulty in forgiving other people?
Or even in forgiving ourselves for certain things we do.
Just about the same.
I thought I'd start with the easier one. Forgiving other people, or forgiving ourselves. Forgiveness. This is the power of death that comes. And so we have trying to get these things clear in our mind is important. It says,
if we are not able to forgive others and not able to forgive ourselves, we can't accept God's forgiveness.
That's evidence. If you don't forgive others, that's evidence you probably haven't forgiven yourself, which is evidence that you don't believe God and you don't believe in His character. All of those things are evident when we sin. Not necessarily, they're becoming evident to us. So. Christ took upon Himself the condemnation of sin. He opened His bosom to the woes of man. He who knew no sin became sin for us. There's the process of death. This is not an imposed death on Christ. It's taking upon Himself the woes of man, opening Himself up to the natural consequences of believing a lie and of exhausting that. That's what caused the death of Christ. That's what made the death of Christ essential. As man's substitute and surety, substitute in what? Substitute for God's wrath or substitute for man's guilt?
Man's guilt.
It's man's guilt. This worthlessness and emptiness, and again we come back to that identity wars theme. I remember the first time, Spirit of Prophecy, Volume 1, page 29 and 30, where it describes the worthlessness and emptiness that Lucifer felt. And for the first time in my life, I thought about Lucifer as worthless. It had never struck me before. I'd never thought about this before. Lucifer worthless and empty? I'd only thought of him as calculating and smart and devious and intelligent and powerful. I'd never thought about him as a little child sitting in the corner, shaking and worthless and empty. The little child in the big man, or the big being, it was a revelation to me, and that this worthlessness became our inheritance when Adam and Eve took the fruit. We took his worthlessness, his emptiness, his vagabond spirit. We took that, Adam and Eve took that, and we inherited. As we perpetuate the sins of our fathers, we continue to perpetuate that worthlessness, that emptiness, that has psychologists scratching their heads as to why people are as dogs returning to their vomit over and over. And why do they do this? Codependent behaviour. Wives being bashed by their husbands, going back again and again and again. Why? This worthlessness, this emptiness that humanity experiences. So Satan's worthlessness transferred to man. Christ on the cross took that upon himself. He took man's worthlessness, his woe. This is what it talks about here. He opened his bosom to the woes of man. Who would voluntarily do that? Someone's wretched, worthless state, those feelings of nothingness and just the groaning of the soul. He just took it all on himself. It's great is the love of God for us in Christ. It says, he was counted as transgressor, that he might redeem them from the curse of the law. And here's the point. We really want to get this clear again, because of the foundation of identity wars, the curse of the law. We talked about this again on Sabbath in chapter 3 of Return of Elijah and chapter 15 of Life Matters. It talks about the law as the protector of our identity. You're all familiar with this? The protector of our identity, because it defines who God is and who we are. It's a definer of who we are to maintain the relationship between someone out there.
Kerry.
Hey,
Hey, Kerry.
come in.
Hey.
This is critical to understand the difference. But the curse of the law. The curse of the law is twofold. Of course, when you transgress the law, we're thinking, in relational terms, we're thinking of transgressing our understanding of who He is. Merciful, gracious, long-suffering, abounding in goodness and truth. When you stop believing that, you are transgressing the law of God's character, and the curse will come upon you. Because you're redefining who God is, and as soon as you do that, you are redefining who you are. And when you do that, you lose the father-son relationship. You are my beloved child. All that goes out the window, and then this torrent of worthlessness comes on the soul. That's the curse of the law. It's not the curse of a list of 10 rules that if you break them, I'm going to break you. This is how men think. It's a completely different way of thinking. These are my rules, you do them, or I kill you. That's the way that it's all right. That's the way that men think. This is the curse of the law. Well, you broke the rules, you're going to have to die.
What?
That is a completely different kingdom understanding, and this is why some people are having great difficulty in understanding why the identity message is moving into the character of a God that is loving, kind, and does not burn, flay, butcher, and torture people to death.
I think it was moving in. It was there first.
Well, it's moving into the fullness of how to explain all of these things in the Old Testament in other places. It's a natural progression because of this relational understanding. It has a completely different... That's why at the beginning of the Identity Wars material, the text, my thoughts are not your thoughts, your ways are not my ways. It's so critical that we understand that the natural man thinks of the curse as imposed. They think of the law as imposed. The law is imposed upon you.
Because that's what's in our... That's how it works in our jurisdiction.
We're raised with this. Here are the rules. It's imposed on you. You will do them.
And you will pay if you break them.
And you will pay if you break them.
That's pay if you get caught breaking them.
Yes.
If you catch up, I'll blow up.
I like mine to be caught.
Yes. So the difference between, and I know there are some, like Tim Jennings uses the term imposed law and natural consequence, or design law. He uses the word design law. We don't like to use the word natural law because that has an overtone leading towards Rome. But design law and imposed law. And we're just saying relationship principles of just natural consequence of relationship principles. This is the outflowing of that process that's taking place. Sin so hateful in his sight was heaped upon him till he groaned beneath its weight. The despairing agony of the Son of God was so much greater than his physical pain that the latter was hardly felt by him. That's also a desire of ages, isn't it? This weight, this agony, which is this worthlessness of Satan, taken by man, being exhausted by Christ. The wages of sin is death. It has its own inherent logical consequence. And this is the only way that that Satan can have the power of death through his belief that God doesn't forgive, and the natural consequences, the worthlessness, the abandoning the position that you're a child, all of those things end in death. And so we see this statement, God permits his Son to be delivered up for our offences, he himself assumes toward the sin bearer the character of a judge, divesting himself of the enduring qualities of the Father. Now you could really horribly misunderstand this statement. How is it possible that God assumes towards the sin bearer the character of a judge, divesting himself of the enduring qualities of a Father? How do we understand this?
So the sin bearer sees it.
Yeah, it's
That's why the sin bearer sees it.
Yeah.
It's the mirror. This is the way the sin bearer is understanding it.
Because that's how we as a people, I mean, when your child rises up and decides to leave or whatever, they've done something wrong and they expect wrath to be thrown upon them as opposed to, are you okay? You hit the fence with the car. No, I'm not cranky that you hit the fence, but are you okay? The whole thing is like, oh, I thought you were going to, come down on me, and I thought you were going to throw me out because of blah 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 blah. No.
All their own thinking. We asked the question: Did Christ pay the price for Cain's sin? So, what did Cain actually say about God?
My sin is more than I can bear.
He says, "My sin or my iniquity is greater than can be forgiven, or my punishment is greater than I can bear." But what did he say in the next verse? What did he say in the next verse? Before that, behold, thou hast driven me out this day from the face of the earth, and from thy face shall I be hid. What is Cain saying?
You don't want to see me anymore.
You don't want to see me anymore.
You've driven me.
You've driven me out. You've driven me away. You've pushed me away because you won't accept my sacrifice. I come to you with my sacrifice. I offer to you the best that I have, and you don't accept it. And I don't like that. So I'm attributing to you all of the attributes of a harsh judge that's unaccepting. Let's just all love one another and accept each other the way we are.
Wow.
Now, Lord, you need to accept me the way I am. I've decided I'm not going to bring a lamb. I don't like it. I don't want to do this. And you are going to accept it.
But God asked him in verse 6, and the Lord said unto Cain, why art thou wroth? Question mark. Why is thy countenance fallen? He's asking him.
So, he does what God asks. He doesn't do what God asks him to do. He gets the natural consequences of that, and he's surprised at the result. And this is what happens in the last days when we proclaim the Sabbath more fully, and then sword, famine and pestilence begin to fall on those who do not come into the Sabbath more fully and don't receive the Spirit. God is pouring out His Spirit on His people, and the others are not happy about it. This is the Cain and Abel story all over again, being replayed out. And what do? They go, that's their opportunity to repent, isn't it? Oh, I've got it wrong. No, these people deserve to die. The reason why we're suffering is because of their transgression of our law. That's how it's going to play out. It's going to play out that way. And so the Father never divests himself of his qualities, because that's who he is. He cannot change his identity. He is the Father. He never ceases to be the Father. And the only way he could be divested of these qualities is in the eyes of the sin bearer. In the eyes of the sinner. That's the only way, because it's not God hiding his face. It's man, through sin, hiding his face from God and projecting onto God that which is false, that which is not true. And Christ had to endure these thoughts of man about his Father. Can you imagine why his spiritual suffering was so much greater than his physical suffering? These thoughts about his Father, they were overwhelming him, these terrible thoughts going through his mind, saying that his Father was horrible and nasty and tyrannical and evil and full of himself, and all of these things he had to carry, because these are the thoughts of man. And he had to carry them.
And then there's the agonies in Gethsemane.
How that tortured him. This is what people think about my Father. Oh, the agony of it.
He was hanging onto the ground because he was starting to feel himself being separated. And though he just kept, 3 times he said, if this cup can be removed, then remove it, but thy will be done. He's so wanted still that connection with his Father, but it was just so tearing him apart.
Yeah. Yeah. That would have been so hard. So herein his love commends itself in the most marvellous manner to the rebellious race. The sin of the whole world was laid upon Jesus. The sin of the whole world. And what is the sin of the whole world? What is sin? Again, let's come back, let's follow this line of thought. What is sin? Sin is the
Transgression of the law.
And the law is a transcript of
God's character.
Therefore, sin is a transgression of God's character. It is the belief of God is something that he's not. And to attribute to him the design of the use of force is not his character. It's clearly revealed God does not use force. God does not use manipulation. And so, and this is a point that some people don't seem to connect the dots on this very well, that if you say to someone, if you love me, you will do what I tell you, and if you don't, you're going to die a very horrible death. That's force. That's manipulation. That's extortion. That's what it is. And yet that's what... It's a threat. It's a bullying approach. It's thumbscrew technology. And yet this is what most people attribute to God. They don't think of it in terms of themselves, because most people, in order to cope with a God like that, you must believe that you're righteous and everyone else is going to hell. Then you can cope with everyone else dying and being lost, as long as you're not the one being lost. Then you don't have to think about those things and being on that side of the equation.
And isn't that all part of the whole thinking of Seventh-day Adventists or Sabbath keepers as well, about, there's this white line, that we're going to get zapped if we're doing something 1 minute before, 1 minute after or something like that, and like, I need to run around, mothers, wives, I never do all this stuff, and it's like, come on, fix it out, That's the whole, it's a law, it's a thing, as opposed to, I just want to spend time with you. I guess I don't want to have to do all that stuff, just put it aside. Let's have time together.
Double portion of the Spirit.
Yeah, I just want to be with you.
Yeah.
Isn't there more people should have been zapped at, 5 to 6 when they went to 7 or something?
Isn't it an irony that there is Jesus speaking the words of life in Capernaum there, and Mary's sitting there, and Martha's running around, and she's in tears. And then she says to Jesus, "Don't you care?
Tell her to do something.
It's not fair. I'm trying to be a good hostess here." It's like, okay, priorities. Yeah. And many people bristle on it and say, well, maybe if she had got out there earlier and helped, they could have all sat there together. There's lots of scenarios we could use to sort of buttress and support Martha in her efforts to display herself as the super hostess that she was. But at the end of the day, Jesus says, Mary has chosen the more excellent thing, and it will not be taken from her. So all those who choose that, it will not be taken from her, which is a blessing. I want to come now to the implications of this in terms of the atonement. The atonement as Christ, the separation of the Father from the Son, because that experience of separation is what Cain expressed, I'm hid from your face. That's the ultimate consequence. I'm separated from you. And so Christ experiences that full separation process from God under the belief that God does not forgive. Because that's what Satan taught the human race. Christ exhausts that. God is not putting any of this on humanity. He's not putting any of this on his Son himself. It is humanity's sin that is put upon him. And so we see then that it is... I lost my train of thought. Coming back to the atonement principle. What is the atonement? It is us being reconciled to God by him exhausting the curse that we brought upon ourselves by accepting Satan's deceptions. It is not an imposed retribution of divine wrath where God is satisfied in his anger about that. How dare these people transgress my commandments and my statutes and my judgments? That type of approach that many people have. And so we then come to the thought of the sacrificial system. And because atonement, in the sacrifice of every lamb, we are demonstrating the principles of the atonement, aren't we? The lamb sacrificed to make atonement, and it shall make atonement. You can read it all through the Leviticus and everything like that. This is a symbol of the atonement. And I'd just like to read a few statements here. This is in Spirit Prophecy, Volume 1, page 266. The Lord first established a system of sacrifices with Adam after his fall, which he taught to his descendants. This system was corrupted before the flood and by those who separated themselves from the faithful followers of God and engaged in building of the Tower of Babel. They sacrificed to gods of their own making instead of the God of heaven. That's sin. To sacrifice to gods of your own making. And notice it says that they sacrificed to gods. What sacrifice would they then be offering to God? What type of sacrifice is this? What do they understand God to be? Someone to be appeased. I'm giving you this sacrifice to appease your wrath. I'm giving you something that's precious to me, that's important to me, in order to calm you down. And that I can go ahead and live my life. I pay you my dues, and I can go ahead and live my life. And this was paganism. Okay, this is really important that we understand that this pagan principle. I want to go just a little bit deeper in terms of Adam. And when Adam took the fruit and he ate it, what happened to his mind? It says in Romans 8:7, the carnal mind. Did Adam receive the carnal mind?
Yes. Yes.
So when he ate that fruit, his mind became carnal, and he was at war with God. In order for him to eat that fruit, he had to perform an act of aggression towards the spirit that had previously been in him. And that was to assert a spirit of independence, a spirit of willfulness, a spirit of rebellion. He had to do all of these things in order to eat that fruit. His mind had to enact all of those processes in order for him to eat that fruit.
It's also a spirit of disbelief. And this is what you're talking about. Not just a spirit of disbelief in what God said that you shall surely die, but a spirit of disbelief, he will not forgive me.
That's interesting, isn't it? I want to hone in on that point because this is where it gets interesting. Because before he eats the fruit, he actually utters some words. And I want to pick up on the words that he uttered. Let me see if I can find, yes, here. Notice on Patriarchs and Prophets, page 56, it says, an expression of sadness came over Adam's face, or the face of Adam. He appeared astonished and alarmed. To the words of Eve he replied that this must be the foe against whom they had been warned. And then, notice he said, Ellen White's quoting him now, okay? It says, he replied, okay? So this is Adam speaking. This is inspiration telling us what Adam is saying. It says, and by divine sentence she must die. Is that the truth?
Well, what were the words of God initially? Thou shalt.
You shall surely die.
Moose, dying you shall die. Natural consequence, dying you shall die.
But separate yourself from the life source. That's the only thing
He
you can.
didn't say I'll kill you. You will die.
So what did Adam say?
Adam said, divine sentence, she must die. Now, where's he getting this idea from? It gets even more interesting this because I found this.
So the next timing of that is.
This is before he's eaten the fruit.
He hasn't eaten the fruit.
He hasn't eaten the fruit, but he's already uttered this concept
So we got the idea
that she must die, and this idea galvanized him to suffer a fate with her because of what he said that must happen to her by imposition.
By divine sentence.
By divine sentence.
Is he going down a path of, is he beginning a path of rationalisation?
This is the query, and the reason why we can see why he could be in a zone here is because what about those 15 or 16% of the angels that were swayed by Lucifer, but then realised and came back? They wrestled, but they didn't sin because they chose to believe God's character is merciful. Once you choose not to believe that, that's sin. That's a violation of the commandments, and the commandments are a transcript of God's character. I just want to reinforce that point about what sin is. And notice what it says. This is in Reflecting Christ, page 58. This is the angels in heaven now. With an intense interest, God's movements were watched by the heavenly angels. Would he come forth from his place to punish the inhabitants of the world for their iniquity? Would he send fire or flood to destroy them? All heaven waited the bidding of their commander to pour out the vials of wrath upon a rebellious world. This is angels.
At what point was this?
This is after the fall of man.
This is after Satan's been thrown out of heaven.
This is after Satan's been thrown out of heaven. This is after the fall of man. I don't remember exactly the time, whether it's... But the quote goes on, and it says, God says, I'll send my son. So it's after the fall. But the angels are ready to destroy the inhabitants of this world. The good angels. Did they not understand the character of God? Well, this would seem to suggest so. They didn't have a clear understanding.
But God's character up till this time had never been in question. So how do they know? They were just wondering, all of a sudden, sin. It's entirely new. It's happened. And they're going,
so
which way is it going to go?
Of course, everything's love, and love is in the air as long as everyone's following the program. But when the program gets violated, then the character gets revealed as to, well, what do you do in these kinds of situations? And this is where the angels were like, yeah, well, and what would we do in this situation if these people started violating and doing this?
And the only example that they had was Jesus saying, no, Satan, you can't be here anymore. You and your friends have got to go. That's the only thing that they had to judge it on. There was a cause and effect. You know, if you don't disbelieve it, if you disbelieve it and not wanting to be here, you've got to go.
Aren't they just ready to reflect the character of the God they're looking at? Because the statement says they're waiting to see if God will do us in fire, and so they're waiting to reflect that character. And what God says, I'll send my son. He wants them to reflect that character.
Exactly. So when Jesus died on the cross, it says that he didn't only reconcile things on earth, but also things in heaven. When they saw the manifestation of this character, it was a revelation to the whole universe.
Angels desire to look into
Angels desiring to understand and look into it, to understand the character of their Father more clearly. This is profound in terms of Adam thinking, she's eaten the fruit. It doesn't say, he didn't say, you will die. You must die. That is imposition. The divine sentence, you must die. And is that the process that then initiates within him that sense of, but I love Eve, and this is not fair? Could that start that process because of a wrong understanding of the character of God? We can't know for sure what was the process that led him, but it could easily start to go down that path. For him to take that fruit, he understood, and this is the thing, he understood the implications of what he was doing. Eve didn't, but he did. He knew what he was doing. He knew enough to know that when he ate that fruit, that he was in rebellion against his Creator, against his Father. And so, the spirit that came into him was the spirit of, what does it say in John 8:44? You're of your father the devil. For he was what? A murderer and a liar. So what did Adam become instantly? A murderer and a liar. Did Adam know this? He didn't know this. He, being the good pope that he was, putting on the white garments and coming up to God, promising. It says in here that he and Eve promised explicit obedience. We will obey you in the future. They're promising obedience. But in his heart are the seeds that will murder the Son of God. But he doesn't know it. He's deceived as to his own condition. And he's still wrangling with the thought as to the woman whom you gave to me. You did this to me. That's that lying spirit, that rebellious spirit. This is the spirit that entered into Adam. So Adam has a spirit now that desires to murder the Son of God because he has the spirit of Satan. He doesn't know this. So how can he repent of something that he knows nothing about?
It has to be revealed to him.
It has to be revealed to him. And when we think about the dominion of the earth, we think about God gave Adam dominion. The spirit of a murderer that was in him, that spirit began to seep into the earth. What happened to the trees?
got the flowers and the leaves.
Spirit of murder. When the idea of man taking an animal and eating it, isn't that the spirit of a murderer? It's not murder to murder an animal because they are not in the technical definition of the word, but it is the spirit of a destroyer. To take a living being, a living entity, and destroy it and consume it.
Wow.
That is the spirit of a destroyer. And that's the spirit that existed in Adam's heart when he ate that fruit. But he didn't know it. And this is where we have to ask another question. Since the spirit of a murderer was in him, and that spirit was on all of the creation, if Christ had not stepped in and carried the crown of thorns from the beginning, what would have happened to everything in the garden? Would have died. Adam destroyed the garden completely. He annihilated the garden. Because of this, he had dominion over this, and this spirit now was going into the earth. Christ had to uphold it by carrying the crown of thorns from the very, very beginning, and carrying the weight of letting that spirit of murder rest upon him so that he could continue to give life to the creation. Is that true? And this is the problem, that we don't understand the dilemma that we're really in this world, because our Father so graciously keeps everything going and everything moving, and therefore we think it's not as bad as it really is. But it's much worse. And so how does God show to Adam that he has the spirit of a murderer in him? He institutes the sacrificial system. He has to show Adam what's in his heart. Therefore, the sacrifice of the lamb is a mirror of what Adam is doing to his Saviour.
And it was Adam that had to do it.
And Adam had to do it. And there's a quote that I have here, and it's quite profound as we think about this. Where is it? I'll find that.
Did Adam ever have an option though?
Ever have an option what?
Not to sacrifice the animal.
Ever have an option not to sacrifice the animal?
Yeah.
Well, this is what we want to unpack. We want to unpack that thought. I just want to find you this quote. I thought I had it. Thought I had this.
No.
Maybe I didn't put the quote in there. Anyway, there's a I'll try and find it. I should put it in here. Let me try and. Yeah, I think this is it. Yes, this is it. It is a most difficult matter to meet the wily foe and discern his falsehoods. To do this demands more than the highest intellectual qualities. To understand what's actually going on requires more than intellect. Simply by your intellect, you cannot understand what's happening in your own psyche, in your own thinking. It is through Christ's sacrifice that man comes into possession of the power to do this. I will put enmity between thee and the woman. That enmity is a capacity to begin to understand, to begin to have an awareness of the spirit of murder and lying that exists within the heart of man. Thrown open the door of the hidden chamber of the mind and heart, that your sins may be set in the light of God's countenance. And this is the part, and Reuben and I were discussing this point. It's profound. God, He takes your trembling hand of faith and lays it on the head of the atoning sacrifice. He takes your hand and places it on the head of the atoning sacrifice. Thus every sin may be confessed and pardoned. Having therefore boldness to enter into the holiest by the blood of Jesus, and having a high priest over the house of God, let us draw near with full assurance of faith. So God is required to take our hand and to put it on the head of the atoning sacrifice, to help us to understand what it is that is in our nature towards Him and His Son. But he has to lead us to that point to see it, because we cannot see it. We cannot comprehend it. Adam promised God implicit obedience when he had fallen. He had no comprehension of the sinfulness of his soul and the depravity of his mind. He had no comprehension whatsoever. How does God explain this to Adam? How does he reveal it to him? And I thought of one illustration, and maybe some of you can help me with this, but it has to do with the miracle of the making of the wine in Cana at the wedding feast. Now, I thought I read somewhere, and I was trying to look for it today, where it says when Christ turned the water into wine, she kind of gives the impression of an accelerated process that brings the water through into the wine. Have you ever...
I thought I read something like that. As if, like, water gets into the plant, goes into the grapes, they get crushed, they become grape juice, and it's just an acceleration of the natural process. It's
an acceleration of a natural process in order to... Have you ever read that?
Something like that. Always had that impression.
This is important to understand, that in the slaying of the lamb, there's an acceleration of a natural process. Because Adam had already killed all of the animals in the garden. He'd already killed them all.
So they didn't know it.
He didn't know it. And so God brings forth the realization of what he has done by asking him to take the knife and to slay this animal, to show in the flesh, because now Adam, and let's understand this, he that is of the flesh does mind the things of the flesh. He doesn't have the capacity to think spiritually in himself. So God has to come to him in the flesh, meet him in the flesh, show him what he has done, and bring that process forward to show him that he is a murderer, in order that he may then receive righteousness for the condition of his soul. So the slaying of the animal does not give him righteousness. The slaying of the animal gives him diagnosis. You see the difference? Diagnosis of his condition, in order that he may then turn and hold on to his Saviour and be made righteous by faith alone.
Always was, it's not.
But Satan perverted this process, and he changed it into the offering of the lamb represents the righteousness of the individual, showing that they are righteous and that they are pleasing to God, and that this is a meritorious act. A complete twist, a complete turning of what that action was designed to do. It was designed to reveal Adam as the killer, and man somehow, because when I have travelled and gone to different places and I talk about the loving character of God, and that our Father is not a destroyer with his own hand, he does not use force with his own hands, he does not kill with his own hands, and I have to keep saying with his own hands, because if I say God does not kill, people use that language, like the Pharisees, against me to say something that I don't mean. And that to say that, well, God commanded the sacrifices. Well, what does that imply? That is to imply to say that the sacrificial system proves that God kills people. When the sacrificial system is designed to show that we kill God or his Son. We are the murderers, not him. And yet we did esteem him smitten of God and afflicted. As it says in Isaiah 53. The human mind completely perverts it, completely turns it around.
My thoughts, not your thoughts.
To put it back on him and to make it meritorious.
It's appeasing, isn't it? It's
appeasement. Either to make it an appeasement to an angry God, or to show that God is willing to use force to terminate that which ceases to be pleasing to him. Both of which are an attack on God's character, which means it is a transgression of the law, which is a transcription of that character. So the very offering implication, the very suggestion that God is the one who is saying, this is what I have to do to my son in order that my divine wrath may be satisfied. This is a human jabbing of God under the table, saying, you are the killer. You are the killer. And you have done this to your son. And we will feign thankfulness for this wonderful gift. All the while, under the table, putting it to God, you are the killer, not me.
This is really serious.
Accuser of the accuser. Accusative spirit.
So God's that God is no different to the God of the heathen.
That God is no different to the God of the heathen. And that's the perfect entry point, Bronwyn, to read this passage in great controversy, because then it brings us to the heart of something very important in terms of this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world. If we don't understand the atonement, we don't understand the gospel. If God is having his divine wrath satisfied in the death of his son, we do not understand the atonement.
No.
And therefore, we do not understand the gospel. Because ultimately, what the object of the gospel is to be ye reconciled to God. We must be reconciled to him. And in order to be reconciled to him, we must know his character. And so Satan is using the very heart of the atonement system to flip it on its back and point it back at God to continue his war against him. And this is the quote. In Great Controversy, page 569. It is Satan's constant effort to misrepresent the character of God, the nature of sin, and the real issues at stake in the Great Controversy. It's his constant effort. Number one, the character of God. Everything he does is to misrepresent the character of our Father. His sophistry lessens the obligation of the divine law. Oh, we don't need to keep the law of Moses anymore. Whee!
We're under grace.
We're under grace. We're in the New Testament. That is aggression towards our Father. It's an aggressive spirit. Whosoever shall teach men to break one of the least of these commandments shall be least in the kingdom of heaven, meaning not in the kingdom of heaven. At the same time, he causes them to cherish false conceptions of God so that they regard him with fear and hate rather than love. The cruelty inherent in his own character is attributed to the Creator. A character of impatience at a certain point. Imposition, imposing law. Justice that causes mercy to cease, so that justice may be satisfied. All of these attributes Satan is putting upon God. The cruelty inherent in his own character is attributed to the Creator. And then it says this, it is embodied in systems of religion and expressed in modes of worship. And this is the pagan, as we read before about the sacrifices that they were involved in. This whole system was designed to point to God as someone that is vengeful and wrathful and demanding of death. This whole system was designed to do that and to turn that which was designed to give a diagnosis of man's condition to actually provide a commentary on God's character as a reflection of man's. It's wicked.
It's like going to a doctor when you've got cancer and the doctor telling you you've got cancer, giving you the diagnosis. And then she's like, how dare you say that about me?
Yeah, and then pulling out a gun and shooting him. I didn't have cancer until you told me.
Yeah, until I walked in this door and you told me.
It's all your fault.
I was having a good day until that. That's what happened. Yeah. Thus the minds of men are blinded, and Satan secures them as his agents to war against God. By perverted conceptions of the divine attributes, heathen nations were led to human sacrifices necessary to secure the divine favour. And we can read, there's plenty of passages, but one in particular, Micah 6 and 7. Wherewithal shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before the high God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings? With calves of a year old? Will the Lord be pleased? Or with 1,000s of rams, or 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for the transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? We see some of King David's frustration when he's trying to bring the Ark of the Covenant back into the capital, and Uzzah touches the Ark and is struck down. It says that David was not happy. And how does David respond to this? He commands us 6 steps and a sacrifice. 6 steps and a sacrifice. What is he thinking? Appeasement of a wrathful God.
Well, that's what he said when Uzzah died. I was just listening to that on the CD this afternoon. He was angry that God had done this.
He was angry, his conception, and so...
Not that Uzzah had touched the ark.
No!
No, that God had struck him
That God
down.
struck him down.
Yeah.
As he understood it.
That's right, yeah.
And it was 20 years before he did it again, wasn't it? How long was it before he could get it back?
Yeah, 20 years.
20 years, yeah.
Damn.
He says sit there on the threshing floor and that's where it can
He's
stay.
over at Eden for a while, yeah. Greatly blessed.
Interesting, isn't it? And then sacrifice. When Solomon, how many animals were slain at the inauguration of the temple?
Oh, thousands.
Was it 120,000 or something?
Massive number.
This is a completely wrong understanding. That none of this was commanded in the Torah. Anywhere. None of it.
No wonder God said, my nostrils are full of...
Now I want to read to you.
Yeah, we're going to come and verses to share with you too, you ready?
Okay. Let me just finish this quote because I want to tie this part in. Because this idea of placation of a deity, this concept of atonement by placating him. It says about to secure the favour of deity, and horrible cruelties have been perpetuated under the various forms of idolatry. Now I just want to read you something from a little book called Antiochus or Rome by F.L. Sharp on the daily. And it says the daily equals paganism. This is the pioneer understanding. Early writings, page 74, God gave the correct view of the daily. It's clearly laid out there as to what this is and why. I want to share with you why it is important. And he just says here that he talks about the Cyrus cylinder, talking about the regular sacrifices of paganism being interrupted or stopped, which is interesting in itself. Then, I won't go into all of that history now. It was also, he says here, now paganism was the dominant system of worship both in Babylon and the Medo-Persian kingdom. It was also carried right over into the kingdom of Rome for several centuries, and according to the inscription found on the Cyrus cylinder, there can be little question but that, like the Jewish system, paganism also had its regular or continual offering, because it spoke of interruption. The regular offering ceased. This is a regular pagan offering in the Cyrus cylinder, talking about, well, obviously it was being offered regularly or on a continual basis. Nor is this at all surprising, seeing that paganism is Satan's counterfeit of the worship of Jehovah. And Ellen White says the same thing. So in the pioneer understanding, the daily is paganism, and paganism is a form of atonement, of appeasement of an angry deity. It is a direct attack on the character of God through a conception of sacrifice aimed to destroy and undermine the gospel. And this is how paganism attacks the gospel. It attacks the gospel through this appeasement process. Okay? Now notice what Ellen White says. She talks about these forms of securing the favour of deity on page 569 and the horrible cruelties perpetuated under the various forms of idolatry. Then she says this: the Roman Catholic Church, uniting the forms of paganism and Christianity, and like paganism, misrepresenting the character of God, has resorted to practices no less cruel and revolting. And what is this referred to in the book of Daniel? The transgression of desolation. The two desolating powers. The daily desolation, as Andrews expresses it, and the transgression of desolation. And what is this desolation that is caused? It is the desolation of understanding the atonement and therefore the character of God. It completely destroys the sanctuary and therefore destroys the host. How long shall be the vision concerning the daily desolation and the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host, which is God's people, to be trodden underfoot? So this issue of the character of God, this issue of the atonement, and I am anchoring this now onto the Pioneer platform, that this is critical to understand. Because Jesus says in Matthew chapter 24, and Robert Whelan makes this point, and I want you to look at this verse, Matthew chapter 24. It's very important that we understand this. If you want to understand the gospel, you need to understand verse 15 of Matthew 24 and what Jesus is actually saying. Matthew 24, 14, and this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world. What gospel? A gospel of a wrathful appeasement? Isn't that the gospel that is being preached everywhere today? Isn't that the gospel preached in Adventism today? Essentially. There are pockets where it's not preached that way, but essentially it's wrathful appeasement. God's wrath was satisfied in the destruction or in the death of his Son. That is fairly common in Adventism. So wherever this is taught, the gospel is not preached. And the gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. When ye therefore, in relation to what I've just said, when ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Are we to understand what the transgression of desolation is? Apparently so. And what is the transgression of desolation? It is the embodiment or the full manifestation, as it says in the Hebrew, excuse me for moving fast on this point, the rum, the uplifting or the exalting of paganism, which is a system of atonement based on appeasement. In God's temple, sitting in the temple of God. Yes, exactly. When it says sitting in the holy place.
That makes sense.
Does that make sense?
I've never ever understood this dirty stuff. Except that it's paganism and blah blah blah. But that makes sense.
Because now we're tying it to the gospel. Now we're tying it to the character of God.
Yeah.
This system of paganism, this daily, this continual rebellion against God, taking that which is designed to give man a diagnosis of his murderous heart, is turned around and it is shown as man being righteous in his offering to a murderous God. And that paganism is absorbed and lifted up in 538 AD when Clovis, in 508, when he takes the French legions, becomes the first son of the Pope, and enthrones this pagan doctrine in the Roman Catholic Church, and the lifting up of the host. This offering, this appeasement of the sacrifice of Christ to God, to satisfy God's wrath. And is explained by Augustine and all of the fathers and Anselm, this system of penal substitution, God's wrath being satisfied. This is all absolutely annihilating the gospel.
It's also the in Catholicism, the exalting of another mediator, which is Mary, which is also to appease these wrathful gods.
So it's a concept of mediation to a wrathful God. And here's the, without getting into too much technicality, but sorry, I'll have to do this, from 457 BC, when we're going through to 1844, with our understanding of the pioneer view, how long shall be the vision? This this false concept of atonement is continuing for this whole time period.
That's right.
Okay, across this, how long shall be the vision concerning the daily desolation and the transgression of desolation? This is covering this whole time period. But the view that Conradi introduced, the rejecter of the 1888 message, is that it wasn't until 538 AD that the daily, which represents the daily mediation of Christ before the Father, is opposed by the papacy, who is the transgression of desolation. So the emphasis shifts to mediation. Is it the mediator of Christ to a God that needs appeasement, or is it the mediation of the papacy to a God that needs appeasement? Do you see the emphasis on man? And think about the mirror. My blood, Father, my blood. Is that a mirror? On how is it language that man is thinking about?
Is that some of the story behind Abraham and Isaac there?
Appeasement. This is the culture that Abraham was brought up in. He was surrounded by people that offered child sacrifice. He grew up in that culture. He probably witnessed it as a young person, as a child. So this is his thinking, his understanding, this daily desolation, this completely changing of God's gift for us and turning it and perverting it. And this concept of atonement would cause the sanctuary and the host to be trodden underfoot until 1844, when a movement would begin to arise that would restore the sanctuary to its rightful place, thus enabling the cleansing of the sanctuary. The cleansing of the gospel. The restoring of the gospel. When I be lifted up, I will draw all men unto me. This is why this is so important. And this shifting of the daily into the heavenly perspective is skewing an understanding of the atonement. And it is, apart from the fact that it destroys the covenants and it does a whole range of other things, it was very carefully calculated. And we make the statement once again in 20 MR 17, 20 MR pages 17 to 21. Ellen White says to Daniels and Prescott, their minds were being worked with evil spirits as they were blazing out on this new view. Now some people say, Ellen White was saying, we don't need to argue about this. But what as Dennis Hoekema points out, the reason she was saying don't argue about it is because we've already settled it. We've already settled this question. I'm very politely telling you to leave it alone. But people don't want to read it. They want to read something else into this. They'd rather go with L.R. Conradi, who hated the 1888 message, and enter into this corrupted system. This is what's leading people off the track. And so the pioneers had the correct view of the daily. The pioneers had the correct view of the daily. The pioneers had the correct view of the daily. How many times do you want me to say that? It's important because it affects the atonement. And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations. And then the end shall come. When you therefore shall see the abomination that makes desolate. What is it making desolate? It desolates the gospel because it presents God as the killer rather than man. And this is what's stirring up so much in people's minds now about saying that God is not the author of death. God is not the author of death. Satan is the author of death. God is not imposing a death penalty on anyone because Christ, in 2 Timothy chapter 1 verse 9 and 10, Christ has abolished death. If Christ has abolished death, does that mean that he could possibly then kill anyone? How can you use that which you've abolished? It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So, what I wanted to do tonight was to anchor down this issue into why the daily is important in terms of the pagan concept of placating a deity and twisting around the purpose of the sacrifice that God had asked Adam to manifest. There was no other way that God could show to Adam what was inside of him. He had to be shown in the flesh because he was in the flesh. He was thinking in the flesh. He had to be shown in the flesh what was in his heart, that he might then be able to have the capacity to confess. Of course, that all has been given to him as well.
Invisible,
So here we find, once again, I just want to, and then you've got a few quotes, Colin, but the sacrificial system, which was designed to show man to be a killer, is now being used by Christianity to show that God is a killer.
But at that point, you read everything that God has established, Satan is twisted.
He's twisted and he's perverted everything. And I need to read you this one quote. Now listen carefully to this, because there's a number of passages in Scripture, in Psalms and in a few other places, that are difficult to understand because God is trying to tell us something to help us. It says here in Review and Herald, September 3, 1901, when Adam yielded to the temptation of the enemy and fell from his high and holy estate, Satan and his angels exulted. But from the throne of God a voice was heard speaking words of mysterious import. And what were those words? Sacrifice and offering thou didst not desire. Mine ears hast thou opened. Burnt offering and sin offering hast thou not required. This is the voice that came from the throne when Adam sinned. What does this mean? He's saying, and that word required means I have not asked for this. I have not asked for this. He's made it very clear. Mysterious import. Why is it mysterious? Because man in his fallen condition twists everything that God does and turns it around back on him.
Because we think God has asked for it.
We think that God has asked for it, that he has demanded this in order for him to be placated, in order for him to show man, okay, now I can see that you are submissive to me.
Wouldn't this also apply to the unfallen worlds and angels as well? Look, Satan's allegations of the law, there must be death. God can't forgive. So that's why they're interested in what has transpired.
Yeah, and what's taking place. It's helping them as well. Yeah. The angels are desiring to, obviously.
Because Satan has completely perverted and twisted everything in the whole universe because of his position as being the covering cherub.
Being the covering cherub, claiming, I know the God of the universe, and telling them what he knows about him as the first of the created beings.
And that's why they were watching his movement so carefully.
That's why it's been so hard for all of creation to actually unpick what's transpiring.
Because he was the first of created beings, and everyone assumed that he knew.
He'd be telling the truth, and he's been a liar, and a murderer.
From the beginning.
So these seeds of murder which Satan had, he's passed on to Adam.
And they're in all of us. They're in all of us. So every time when we come to the morning eve sacrifice, we have the opportunity to be reminded of what we are by nature in ourselves. We have the seeds within us of murderers and liars. And this is the thing that we need to be careful when we think about finding atonement other ways, like thinking about people who abort babies, thinking about other people that are willing to do sexual misconduct towards children. If we begin to think that we are not capable of those types of things, we are deceived.
The depravity of humanity.
The grace of God fearing others.
That's the hard thing. It's so easy to seek to find atonement through the manifested wickedness of others. I can find atonement in those things because I would never do anything like that.
It's interesting that you say that, because apparently in the jail system, people are in there for all manner of crime. If there is a known pedophile comes in, they they really go there for that. So it's the same thing.
It's atonement for them.
Yeah.
They need pedophiles in the jails to give atonement to them.
So I'm not that bad.
Yeah.
I'm not like that.
It's like, and it's like, as a friend of mine said to me, his daughter was involved in prostitution, and she would say to her father, "Well, we're not like those lower class prostitutes down there. We're upper class prostitutes."
Like the adjective makes a difference.
This is the reasoning of the human mind. The real estate and the building makes difference to the class of prostitute that one is.
Maybe how much it was.
And how much money is charged. This is the challenge for all of us, and that's why this message is laying the glory of man in the dust. There is nothing in us that is any good. We are by nature murderers and liars, and the only way that we can escape this is to ask for the mercy of God and the grace of God, that we might be crucified with Christ. And the evidence of this will be manifested in a humility and a patience towards the sinful conduct of other people around us.
So back to Kerry's question before about was there no other option for Adam than to have to slay the lamb? Like, is that like in heaven the angels that didn't sin and get tossed out with Satan, they were forgiven and there was no sacrifice needed. With man, is that because we're infected with the blindness that we don't know what we are, and that's the only way?
We were not yet eternal either, were we?
No. Because that one might often
No.
have written...
We were on probation.
Yeah, probation. We didn't have immortality.
Yes.
Because that one might often wrote things like that only the death of the Son would atone for.
Yes, of course. Yeah, and of course...
And it makes you think that it was a requirement.
And we come back to the point, the quote I read in Faith I Live By, page 104, it is transgression that makes the death of Christ, transgression of the law that makes the death of Christ essential. And what is transgression of the law? It is the transgression of God's character. And what is the transgression of God's character? It is the belief that He will not forgive. That makes the death of Christ essential. You can read it differently.
So if Adam had the capacity to believe that God would forgive him,
Yes,
then there would have been no sacrifice needed.
correct.
But there was no capacity.
But once he took that fruit, that was impossible.
There was no capacity.
Because that spirit came into him and that was sealed.
The mind of Satan
Yeah.
would not allow his prisoners to go.
We became sold under sin. We became slaves to him, and there was no way out other than the death of Christ once that had occurred. And that's why I make the point, which again is causing quite a ruckus, is that 15 or 16% of the angels were forgiven without the need for death to occur, which proves our point that we are making.
Because they believed God was...
Because they chose to believe when they were offered.
Is that what he was trying to do with Pharaoh in the firstborn?
Trying to do with?
Pharaoh in the firstborn.
Yeah.
To
Ask Pharaoh for repentance, to come to God, rather than, why do I have to kill all the firstborn?
yeah, of course, it's to bring him to repentance. But of course, in his case, it's just your God against my God.
Wow. Question.
Yeah.
Solomon, let's flick forward to Solomon's temple, the 120,000 or whatever sheep was slaughtered. The Shekinah glory still came to the temple, even though it was bathed in blood.
Yeah.
It sort of seems like, well, you've done the right thing. You slaughtered all these animals, I'm still going to come.
The Holy Spirit still dwells in me, even He knows that I am a murderer, a liar, a rapist.
Exactly.
It still dwells in me.
So we need to keep this in mind in terms of our interaction with people around us, because there is going to be a 38% of the population that will begin to manifest a spirit towards homosexuality that is quite self-righteous. It's arrogance. It's just arrogance. Because we all have the potential.
Wow.
And I just make the point.
What happened?
Huh?
I've been at work all day.
Oh, the yes, no,
It's yes.
It's yes.
Yes, sorry,
61.
61 to 38.
Oh, okay.
So they're going to vote in gay marriage.
No warning, apparently, 60-40.
Okay.
So what's the only difference between homosexuality and heterosexuality? It's they both have sex attraction. So it's the same. It's just opposite rather than the same. It just has a different mechanism for the same human perverted process. So obviously it's taking a step, yes, and it does have impact on families, and yes, the earth will vomit out the inhabitants thereof, but we notice in Leviticus chapter 8, and I am detouring here, it's not only homosexuality that vomits out the inhabitants, it's also adultery. Kind of in the same list.
It's still further attack on marriage and institution.
Yeah, it's just going further down.
So it's really the Sabbath that be taken away now.
Great
Yeah.
manifestation of in the channel.
It's the first one of the twin institutions to be taken
Yeah,
out.
it's pretty well
In Australia.
Pretty well gone
And why is all this happening? Because Adventism rejected the 888
now.
message.
Message. Yeah.
That's why it's happening. We just want to close on this point. Romans chapter 7. This is very important because this is the nature of man. Verse 9, for I was alive without the law once, but when the commandment came, sin revived and I died. Verse 10, and the commandment which was ordained to life, I found, or I twisted, or I perverted, to make it unto death. That's what it should read in there. For sin, taking occasion by the commandment, deceived me, and by it slew me. So sin is slaying by the commandment. It's using the commandment to slay. It's taking the commandments of God and imposing onto him, it flicks into the mirror that God is wanting to kill. And so that's what comes back. And so Satan, through the law, bouncing off the law, causes us to think of him as tyrannical, and that keeps us under the power of death, so that we can't overcome our sin. That's what sin does to us. Verse 12, wherefore the law is holy, and the commandment holy and just and good. Was then that which is good made death unto me? Does the law have death in it? No, it's holy, just and good. God forbid, but sin that it might appear sin, working death in me by that which is good, that sin by the commandment might become exceeding sinful. And that was the purpose of the sacrificial system. Exactly this point. It's all contained here in Romans 7. That death is coming by sin using the law to make us think that the law demands death inherently in itself. But again, we just reiterate the point that if death is inherent in the law, then death is inherent in God. Because it's a transcript of his character. And that is impossible. For all reasons, I am the resurrection and the life. It doesn't say I am life and death. All those quotes that talk about this. He's the restorer, Satan is the destroyer, on and on and on. So, there we go. We covered a number of points.